The year is 2006, and after the fumble that was the PlayStation 3's announcement, Sony needed a launch lineup of games to win back the good faith that they had established with the PlayStation 2. Among the 14 titles poised to support this next-generation console, the true standout was an alternate history, World War II first-person shooter with killer alien monsters, and an arsenal of weapons that reminds you that this fledgling franchise was developed by none other than Insomniac Games. That game was Resistance Fall of Man. After developing some of PlayStation's premier 3D platforming titles, Spyro the Dragon and Ratchet & Clank, Resistance Fall of Man was a departure from Insomniac's previous works in almost every aspect, but particularly by being a first-person shooter. In a post-Halo world, PlayStation fans were looking for their Halo, and many believed Insomniac had developed Sony's Halo killer. The game sold well and reviewed even better. The franchise would see 2 main sequels, as well as a couple of handheld spin-offs. But in 2021, with Halo Infinite's release on the horizon, it's been nearly a decade and an entire console generation since fans have seen an entry in the Resistance series. Today, we revisit the Resistance Trilogy with 4 questions. Does it hold up? Was comparing it to Halo a mistake? Is remembering it that way a little alternate history in itself? And lastly, is there enough meat on the bones to consider a reboot or remaster? Grab your auger rifle, soldier. I'll see you on the other side. At the turn of the century, an alien race called the Chimera made landfall in Russia and began using otherworldly technology and swarms of Chimeran virus-ridden alien insects to transform Europe and convert its inhabitants to reflect their image in what is ostensibly a quest to conquer Earth. The United States sends a task force to the United Kingdom under Operation Deliverance to contain the spread of the Chimera, and that's where our hero, Sergeant Nathan Hale, enters the chat. Unfortunately, Hale and his unit are swarmed by Chimeran forces and are nearly wiped out almost immediately. If it weren't for Hale's resistance to the Chimeran virus, whoa, I'm just now realizing that might be the titular resistance. Anyway, the game would end right there, but Hale awakens to discover he has developed superhuman strength, reflexes, health regeneration, kind of, but we'll get to that later, and a set of glowing amber-colored eyes that would make Bella Swan throw her prepubescent life away. Hale goes on to partner up with English soldiers, going behind what are now enemy lines, fighting off hordes of Chimeran soldiers and assault vehicles in an attempt to wipe out the Chimeran race once and for all. After destroying the Chimeran Tower's power core in London, setting off a chain reaction, taking out the Chimeran network and resulting in a giant explosion, Nathan is listed as killed in action, until a post-credit scene shows him being rescued, or potentially captured, by a mysterious gang of soldiers whose compatriots' corpses we found littered throughout our journey. Turn the clocks forward 2 years and we find that the Chimera are not extinct and have made their way over to the good old US of A. Our hero, Nathan Hale, was in fact rescued by a sect of the United States military known as Sentinels and is receiving treatment for the Chimeran virus. As Hale travels to cities and towns all over the continental United States to stop Chimeran forces from infecting America, he neglects his treatments, which exacerbates his condition, and his fellow soldiers begin to question his involvement in their mission. Once again, cheating death after killing Daedalus and setting off a nuclear explosion in an attempt to eradicate the Chimera, Hale and fellow Sentinel soldier Corporal Joseph Capelli escape and crash land. Capelli awakens to discover that the Chimeran influence has taken hold of Hale. With sorrowful conviction, Capelli executes Hale. Cut to black. As a result of Hale's execution, Capelli is dishonorably discharged and throws the proverbial salt in the wound by marrying Hale's adoptive sister, Susan. Really, you two? And lives with her and their son in a survivor community in a series of tunnels under Haven, Oklahoma. Now that the Chimeran virus can be cured thanks to Hale's blood containing a protein that helped Malakov develop a vaccine, the genocidal Chimeran forces are wiping out the remaining human militias, and as for the nuclear explosion Hale set off, well, it supercharged the Chimeran network and opened a wormhole in New York City that is helping to terraform Earth into the Chimera's new icy tundra of a home planet. Yeah, it's bad. Capelli reluctantly leaves his family behind on a quest to New York City to save the human race. Hitting several roadblocks along the way, Capelli ultimately reaches the Big Apple, where he sends a farewell to his family and stages an attack on the Chimera. After sabotaging another power core, they destroy, you guessed it, another tower, closing the chilling wormhole and returning Earth's climate to some semblance of homeostasis. With the human race now having the upper hand, the Resistance can finally defeat the Chimera and reclaim Earth. Capelli is reunited with his family, and with a Chimera-free life on the horizon, Capelli can finally rest knowing his family, and the world, are safe from the alien threat. If you were to ask me, I'd say that the setting and the lore of the Resistance universe is more interesting than the story and the plot of the games themselves, the only exception maybe being Resistance 3. While the story and plot of each game are serviceable, it's no Last of Us. Not that every game needs to hold a candle to Naughty Dog's road trip horror story, but that might be the problem with Resistance in the eyes of Sony. Insomniac has even spoken about how Resistance 4 wasn't given the green light because the hybrid nature of the Chimera was too similar to what The Last of Us was doing with their evolved cordyceps fungus/zombie shtick. Not to mention a lead character with an innate immunity to the virus, a vaccine created from their blood, and the whole Trek Across America bit. I think you get my point. They did greenlight Days Gone though, so who's to say how or why Sony makes the decisions they make. But I think if Resistance were to make a comeback, the story should be rebooted with more focus put into the motives of the characters and their personalities. I think even with a basic plot of creepy mysterious aliens are invading, stop them at all costs, while making your way around a country that's being overrun, if something were done to better connect the characters with that plot, Resistance could make a strong return. But it would need to be executed better than Resistance 3's attempt to do that, in my opinion. Now, this is just an idea for funsies, but if you did a single-shot game where you play as Nathan Hale and it starts on a plane landing in York, England, setting out on Operation Deliverance, and once you complete your first objective, you hop into an aircraft that will fly you to Grimsby and other locations. While you're in realish time transit, you can use a workbench to upgrade your weapons or use the opportunity to deliver some exposition to the player. I think that could make for a really interesting campaign experience in a reboot, and pay homage to the original game's level structure. I also think that works on a narrative level, and that Hale will stop at nothing to defeat the Chimera. He's kind of the perfect soldier in that way, and making the mission take place over the course of a day or two would play into Hale's eagerness to stop the Chimera. Resistance Fall of Man is a simple, linear first-person shooter, but features a weapon wheel of creative firearms, some light vehicle combat, and a series of landmine obstacles to navigate your way through during Nathan Hale's trek of the United Kingdom. Intel documents can be found in the nooks and crannies of each level, and there are skill points that can be earned by completing challenges, which almost makes up for PlayStation's lack of trophies around the time of Fall of Man's release. Over the course of the campaign, you'll complete 11 chapters with 2 to 3 sections in each, broken up by location, and loading screens that, just like pulling up to a colonoscopy appointment in a Corvette, show its age. It's difficult to say, as my perspective has been skewed by modern game design and controllers, but even for a shooter from 2006, Resistance feels clunky. It's loads of fun and a compelling game, but I couldn't help but notice stiffness in movement between the right analog stick and what I was seeing on screen. To be fair, I did play this game with a DualShock 3 on a PlayStation 3 from 2013, but still, that's really the best case scenario to play Resistance Fall of Man in 2021. The game also features health regeneration, but the health bar is separated into quarters, and if your health dips below one of those quarters, you'll need to find a health pack to regain the quarter of health that you lost. Otherwise, it'll only regenerate by rounding up to the nearest quarter. Don't get me wrong, I know I sound negative, but I enjoyed my time with the game and would definitely recommend anyone with an interest in the franchise to check it out, but taper your expectations of this game's competency as a first-person shooter by today's standards. You can look forward to a challenging experience, though. I began to notice a pattern in the sections of the chapters where enemy quantity and variety increased as I made my way through a section, which is par for the course, but I often found myself being overwhelmed while trying to assess the threat in each combat scenario, then clearing it on the second attempt after remembering I have more weapons at my disposal than the carbine or the bullseye. The game has some truly unforgiving checkpoints that result in replaying many of these enemy encounters, but complements the overall experience by presenting opportunities with the weapon wheel's diverse arsenal to more cleverly get back to where you were and give yourself a better chance at clearing the encounter. I could see how some players might find these checkpoints annoying if they aren't as charmed by the setting and story as I was, but I think it's balanced appropriately. There are some creepy and mildly unsettling sections in Fall of Man that add a flavor to this game that I very much appreciate. I think it speaks to Insomniac's complete 180 from their previous games that most gamers, or maybe just my friends from high school, wrote off as for kids, and I think that this 180 is what makes the franchise truly special. I genuinely enjoyed spending time in Fall of Man, even in 2021. Maybe that's nostalgia, but there's something about the alternate history setting and the mystery of the Chimera that really grip me and compensate for some of Fall of Man's gameplay shortcomings. A quick side note, a more positive tell of this game's age is its replayability support. Featuring weapons like the Reapers or the Backlash Grenade, just to name a few, that are only accessible during a second playthrough of the game. In a time when those features would have been pre-order bonuses or purchasable via microtransactions, this feature is a time capsule of how game design was before online stores were integrated into seemingly every game. Resistance 2 follows a similar structure as Fall of Man, but ditches the weapon wheel and health bar in exchange for a 2-weapon system and standard health regeneration. The campaign is broken up into 8 chapters and a prologue, with checkpoints that break up the sections in each. I know it sounds like there's less game here, having 3 chapters less than Fall of Man, not counting the prologue, but 2's chapters are noticeably longer and more challenging. Like, seriously more challenging. I died so much it was kind of ridiculous, and I was only playing on normal. The most ironically glaring complaint I have with this game is how dark it is. My capture card made this even worse, to be fair. I found myself leaving the flashlight on for most of the game because so much detail was getting lost in the shadows, with no brightness adjustments in the game's options menu. Considering this game came out during the CRT TV generation, which would make it look even darker, I'm surprised I don't remember these brightness issues being a problem in Resistance 2, because I found it to be the major flaw with the game, outside of the 2-weapon system. But that is pretty nitpicky considering I can adjust the settings on my TV and curb the issue, and my capture card was making it considerably worse. But who doesn't include a brightness adjustment in the menus? I don't know. I digress. True to Resistance fashion, 2 has some pretty creepy moments that definitely raised my heart rate in several sections. I really think that these unsettling segments are key if Insomniac or Sony wanted to revitalize this Resistance series. Mixing some horror elements with first-person shooter campaigns always adds a flavor I appreciate, and outside of other PlayStation exclusives having horror elements, I'm looking at you, The Last of Us and Days Gone, which may dissuade Sony from wanting to bring back Resistance. I think it shows Insomniac's range and makes PlayStation stable of first-party studios even stronger than they already are. Also, compared with Halo, I'd say that these moments in Resistance surpass the Flood sections in Halo in terms of being scary. The Flood are unsettling and mysterious, but so are the menials in Fall of Man and the Grims in Resistance 2. But, and this is just my opinion, they feel like they present more of a threat to the player than the Flood do to Master Chief. I'm considerably more frantic during these sections of Resistance than I am fighting the Flood in Halo. Lastly, the missing weapon wheel is truly the biggest letdown of Resistance 2. I found myself mostly hunting for an auger or far eye, but being stuck with a bullseye or carbine. Not that they are not fine weapons for taking out standard Chimeran hybrids, but removing the choice for the player to make and the fun of cycling through the weapon wheel took something special away from the campaign experience. Plus, the weapons you encounter tip you off to what kind of enemy is ahead. If you find the Rossmore shotgun or the Splicer, you know that the invisible chameleons or Grims are just around the corner. If you find a Lark rocket launcher, you know you're about to face at least one Titan. If you find a Far Eye, you know you're about to be in a large open area and there's going to be plenty of steelheads with augers. It made the campaign more predictable, and I really believe that if Resistance 2 had a weapon wheel and health packs, it would have been a better game. Resistance 3 is an odd game for me. It does so much right, but also misses the mark in other areas. First of all, there are 20 chapters this time around, but here's the catch. They're much shorter. I think I completed the second chapter in less than 8 minutes. That's an extreme example, so take it with a grain of salt, but know that they're all generally shorter than the chapters in Fall of Man, or more specifically, Resistance 2. But we do see a return of the weapon wheel and health packs. The weapon wheel keeps the gameplay fresh, and instead of constantly looking for ammo or a gun to switch with on the ground, like I did in Resistance 2, I would cycle to my next favorite weapon, or the weapon I wanted to level up, and keep killing Chimera, but in a new way, similar to how Ratchet and Clank works. Health packs not only make sense narratively, Yes, Capelli was also a sentinel with Chimeran infusion, receiving inhibitors like Hale, but he was cured with Hale's vaccine and lost the Chimeran health benefits like anyone who gets fired from their job and lives inside a tunnel in Oklahoma. The weapon wheel and health packs are key components to the Resistance series recipe, and I was happy to see them return. I played all 3 games on normal difficulty, and without a doubt, Resistance 3 is the easiest of the series, which is a bit of a shame. I enjoyed the challenge the first 2 games presented, so this resulted in me cranking up the difficulty to hard, which I came to regret as I noticed a slight difficulty spike around Chapter 18. Also, this is the first game in the series where I didn't have to reconfigure the controls, although the option is there. By the time of the game's release, I think the modern FPS control scheme had become ubiquitous, and Insomniac did a much better job pairing that with the features that Resistance requires, like alternative weapon fires. But to be fair, the game could have just remembered my weapon configuration from when I played the game back in 2014 or whenever that was. Resistance 3 is the most cinematic of the 3 games, but it's also held back by the console hardware and that the performance is weak and drops frames all the time. I'm no digital foundry, so I can't show you metrics, but take my word for it. It chugs, and when compared to its contemporaries from 2011, it's honestly just not acceptable for a first-person shooter. This paired with a noticeable step down in enemy AI broke immersion, thus tainting the game's cinematic qualities. I would often find enemies standing still, clearly waiting for me to thin out the crowd before engaging, while others roamed and attacked. I noticed this more at the beginning. Maybe I got used to it, or maybe the set pieces in the beginning of the game were more demanding and hindered AI. I'm no developer, so I have no clue. These are just guesses. But it's really a shame, though, because I spend a lot of Resistance 2 thinking about how surprisingly good the AI is, especially when you consider the time of the release, and Resistance 3 feels like a step down from that. I'm not sure how much of the motion control integration that Resistance 3 features has an effect on how the game performs when not using motion controls, but maybe sacrifices were made? Again, I don't know. The game does things that I really like. Playing the game earns you points that you can spend in the menus to unlock cheats like infinite ammo or all weapons available, which I didn't use to be fair. These don't help much in terms of accessibility, as you'd have to earn points normally before being able to access these features, but it's cool that they're there, and there are way more than the 2 I mentioned before. Also, throughout the campaign, weapons level up, similar to Ratchet and Clank, and it's cool to see Insomniac bring some of their signature features to Resistance. Weapon levels are able to be carried over to a second gameplay, but I reset my weapons for my playthrough this time around to try to make the game as genuine and challenging as possible. These features are something I would absolutely love to see in a reboot, and I think when you look at what Insomniac has been doing in terms of collectibles earned in-game in both Spider-Man and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, a rebooted Resistance could have similar collectibles be a trademark as well. Some quick nitpicks. I'm not a huge fan of the game's heads-up display. It's serviceable, and it may just be that better HUDs exist now that have skewed my perspective, or that I simply preferred the HUDs in the first 2 games, believe it or not. But I remember not being too keen on Resistance 3's HUD back in the day. I also noticed a few sections where it looks like Insomniac had to make compromises. At the end of Chapter 3, there's a particular moment where what would normally be in a pre-rendered cutscene was instead rendered in-engine and the lip syncing is off. It felt cheap and totally killed the moment and sucked away any weight that moment had quicker than a surgeon working on a Kardashian after having one too many hors d'oeuvres at the Met Gala. Thinking of the polish that Insomniac is known for these days, I think these nitpicks are clear indicators of Insomniac being rushed to finish this game, and it's unfortunate because I spent a lot of the time playing the game thinking about the game's development instead of the minute-to-minute gameplay and the situations the characters found themselves in. You can definitely tell Resistance 3 was rushed, and unfortunately, that may be the way Sony remembers the franchise. I know I've been mostly negative about Resistance 3, but it does a lot right and is fun, despite the performance dips. It's just that the mysterious dark charm of the first 2 games was replaced with a deeper, more character-based story, and I think a marriage of the 2 would be stronger than either one on its own. Resistance 3 shows the potential that the series has if rebooted. If a development team were to revisit the series, I would hope that they would find a way to blend the best aspects of each game into a reboot. Like, take the tone of Fall of Man, the weapons and co-op from 2, with the gameplay and character depth from 3, then polish it up to Insomniac's modern standard, and I think that would be a great game. After replaying the trilogy in 2021, I think even a super polished remaster wouldn't be what's going to spark a serious enough interest for Sony to want to fund another entry. I think a full-blown reboot is in order if Sony and Insomniac want to do the series justice and have a truly great first-party exclusive on their hands. But you won't see me turn my nose up at a super polished remaster, even if only to preserve these games and bring back their servers. Speaking of which, unfortunately, in April of 2014, Insomniac shut down the multiplayer servers for the Resistance Trilogy, so it's impossible to experience their respective competitive and cooperative modes in 2021. But, as someone who spent countless hours in the multiplayer suites for Fall of Man and Resistance 2, including Resistance 2's co-op, I'll do my best to recollect what it was like from a compound of 2021 research and what I can recall from my high school years. I'd also like to note, for your sake, I have little to no experience with Resistance 3's multiplayer outside of a handful of matches in 2013-2014, right before the servers shut down. So, in the name of transparency, I'll skip talking about it subjectively since I was so late to the party and wasn't around in the game's heyday. Resistance Fall of Man came paired with a multiplayer mode that pitted humans versus Chimera, similar to Gears of War, which was Cog versus Locust, with the twist of each having their own abilities, but ultimately forced the player to play as whatever species team they were assigned. The dedicated server supported up to 40 players, and map selection hinged on the number of players in each match, as well as the game type. In addition to a ranked matchmaking mode featuring free-for-all, team deathmatch, and team objective game types, you could create custom games with friends, and if your internet was down, you could play locally with up to 4 players. The multiplayer was later supported with 2 map packs, each featuring 2 new levels, and if you wanted to share the campaign experience with a friend, there was a basic cooperative mode, but it lacked the weapons featured in the game's second playthrough. I remember liking Fall of Man's multiplayer a lot. I remember feeling like people were missing out by not having access to it and trying to convince friends to get a PS3 to check it out. I really wanted to unlock all of the game's character customization rewards by ranking up, as they were really the only way to let everyone know who the alpha was in the lobby. But I do remember it lacking polish, and it definitely lacked the player base of competitive shooters of its time. It had the bones of a good competitive game, but when compared with its contemporaries, it left a lot to be desired. But that's where the sequel comes in. Resistance 2 again created battles between humans and Chimera, but allowed up to 60 players and featured free-for-all, team deathmatch, core control, and skirmish game types. Due to popular demand, Meltdown returned as a game type, which was featured in the Team Objective playlist in Fall of Man, and the game would also receive support via updates that allowed players to play as Cloven, who were mentioned in intel documents in both Fall of Man and Resistance 2's campaigns, as well as a Ravager and a female soldier. Resistance 2's PvP was a huge improvement over Fall of Man in terms of functionality and player base, but having classes that could be picked before a match or between deaths produced opportunities for imbalance, especially when mixed with the differences between human and Chimeran weapons and abilities such as Berserks, which unlocked special abilities after earning experience or completing objectives and remained active until the player died or the Berserk bar ran out of juice. I remember wanting to play Resistance 2 with the marksman rifle to simulate using a battle rifle in Halo, but knowing you could just tag people with a bullseye and the time to kill was quicker, why would you make it harder for yourself? Resistance 2 also featured a class-based cooperative mode, which, unlike Fall of Man, told a separate story that had players fighting through hordes of Chimeran enemies while capturing objectives across several maps. You could pick off enemies and support allies with ammo drops as a special op, throw up a portable shield and mow down enemies as a soldier, or leech health from enemies and give it to your teammates like a weird vampiric Robin Hood as a medic. Resistance 2 was the franchise's breakthrough in terms of multiplayer in my experience. It captured the attention of myself and friends, and we had entire weekends spent in the cooperative mode, farting into beanbag chairs and yelling, "Oh no, it's Chuck Norris!" as an armored advanced Chimeran soldier kicked its way through our front line. Those times are some of my most cherished memories in gaming, and Resistance 2 will forever hold a special place in my heart as a result. It's truly a shame that this cooperative mode has not been preserved by being accessible in some way. Resistance 3's multiplayer mostly followed the layout of the first 2 games, but decreased the player count to 16. It also provided a progression system that unlocked customizable loadouts that included special attributes to spice up the gameplay. The cooperative mode was stripped back to a basic campaign co-op mode, ditching the 8-player co-op mode from Resistance 2, press F to pay respects. I know that Insomniac has said that Resistance 2 was too large in scope and they wanted to narrow their focus with 3, especially while being rushed to put the game out, but Resistance 2's co-op elevated the game, and I know that for a lot of people, it's a huge reason why we look back fondly on Resistance 2. The 8-player co-op omission is not a mistake I would make twice if I were developing a reboot in 2021. Now, I didn't play much of Resistance 3 multiplayer back in the day, but I've heard people say that they enjoyed it, and from what I remember, it was good. Not great, but good. In the event that Sony has Insomniac or another studio working on a Resistance reboot, it is critical to get the multiplayer right, or I would focus solely on the campaign in an 8-player cooperative mode. With Halo's Arena Combat and Quake's remaster recently being announced, I think we see Sony attempt to throw their hat in the ring, but like I said, it is imperative that they get it right because it will be compared to every other FPS on the market. This isn't like The Last of Us's Factions mode or Ghost of Tsushima's Legends mode, where there's a novelty to it that makes it special. Arena combat and the sandbox the game's physics and weapons allow for will be what people are looking at, and the Halo comparisons will come thick and fast. If it's not up to par, it will not bode well for a reboot. Despite fans of the series constantly letting Insomniac know how they feel about the Resistance series, there seems to be no news of a remaster or reboot anywhere to be seen. That means, thanks to Sony believing in generations, the only way to play these games is to unearth that dusty PlayStation 3 of yours and hope you held on to at least one DualShock 3 or 6-axis controller. All the games include this feature I'm about to mention, but I was particularly surprised that Fall of Man features button remapping, which, for a console game from 2006, is completely ahead of its time. Fast forward to 2021, when Insomniac has become well known for great games with top-tier accessibility options, they clearly aren't jumping on any trends. Being able to remap my control layout to resemble a hybrid of default Halo and Call of Duty control schemes made the experience entirely more enjoyable. This may help curb some of the hurdles a modern gamer might run into while checking out Resistance, or make them more playable to people with specific requirements for input. I will note, though, that certain actions in Fall of Man, like crouch and aiming down sights, behave accordingly to the default controls. Crouch, normally being mapped to the left trigger, requires the player to hold it down with no option to set it to toggle even if you map crouch to circle or L3, and aiming down sights is set to toggle, so even if you map it to L1 or L2, holding it down and releasing will leave you looking down the sights and requires another button press to return to hipfire. I will note, though, that they fixed this in the sequels. I had a lot of fun revisiting the Resistance Trilogy. Running through alien towers and cycling through creative weapons Insomniac imagined for this alternate timeline of world history kept me engaged and honestly wanting more. It's a shame that I had to unearth my PlayStation 3 to defeat the Chimeran threat, but I think that added to the nostalgia trip. If I removed my rose-tinted glasses and imagined myself playing this game for the first time on this hardware, I think I would be interested in the tone and setting of the game, but would probably be wondering what all the fuss is about after going hands-on. Although the Resistance franchise had comparisons to Halo thrust upon it at the time, Halo 2 is a vastly more competent shooter despite hitting store shelves a whole 2 years prior to Resistance Fall of Man. I'd even go as far as to say that Halo Combat Evolved feels better to play than Fall of Man. It literally has more evolved combat, and it was a launch title for the original Xbox. Even when compared to one of its contemporaries relative to 2006, Call of Duty 3 feels like a better game to compare Fall of Man with, being a World War II FPS launching alongside the PlayStation 3, but even Call of Duty 3 is a smoother experience. Resistance 2 launched alongside Call of Duty World at War in 2008 and pales in comparison mechanically as a first-person shooter, especially considering Halo 3 had been out a little over a year and was arguably bigger and better than ever. Things get a little more interesting when comparing Resistance 3 with Halo 4, but it's mostly because Resistance 3 was good, but rushed, releasing in 2011, and Halo 4 is considered the franchise's first misstep, releasing in 2012. but is still head and shoulders above what Resistance 3 was doing mechanically and in performance as the exclusive FPS for the PlayStation 3. I think anyone that was looking for PlayStation's answer to the Xbox's Halo franchise would be underwhelmed by the feel of Resistance as a whole when doing a direct comparison game by game. Even with the Killzone franchise reeling about in the shadows, Xbox had PlayStation cornered in the console FPS market. Even now, I can't think of a single first or second party studio that's working on an FPS for PlayStation. Just Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo, which are both published by Bethesda, which is now owned by Microsoft. Looking back on it now, I think these comparisons were simply hopeful optimism for Sony ponies and a chance for Xbox to put a boot on the neck during the console war between Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. There's really nothing to compare here outside of a couple similarities and some YouTube conspiracy theory-like mental gymnastics to connect the dots. With studios like Bluepoint remaking and remastering classic PlayStation games for Sony, like Demon's Souls, Shadow of the Colossus, and Uncharted, giving the Resistance Trilogy the Bluepoint treatment might be a good way to gauge the market's interest in the Resistance franchise, or at least preserve the series for fans and the PlayStation brand's legacy, while also filling the FPS void in PlayStation's exclusive games lineup and giving Insomniac the freedom to continue working on Spider-Man and Ratchet & Clank and Wolverine. But I think if Sony really wanted to satisfy the fans and give new players something to be excited about, they'd completely reboot the series. I consider myself a fan, and I'm okay with leaving the original in the past as long as I'm getting something new and improved. I think the universe Insomniac created with Resistance is compelling enough to reboot, and this time around, focus on what makes the series great. If they focus on fine-tuning the FPS mechanics and on telling a deeper, more compelling story, they could release a single-player FPS similar to that of Machine Games' Wolfenstein or Arcane Studios' Prey or Dishonored, and fans would be delighted. But include a competitive mode and an 8-player co-op similar to Resistance 2, and Sony could have something huge on their hands. Maybe even add the multiplayer and co-op later as a free update similar to Ghost of Tsushima, but at launch would be ideal, especially seeing the backlash 343 is receiving, not including co-op and Forge in Halo Infinite's release. That may be wishful thinking, but if Sony wanted an FPS in their arsenal, I think Resistance is the series to revive. Definitely over Killzone. Sorry, Killzone. Well, that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, if you spent a lot of time with Resistance 3's multiplayer, let us know how it was at the height of its popularity. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when my next video goes live. Thank you for watching.